If you're ready to go green, but you're not quite sure if you're completely ready to pull the plug on gasoline, so to speak, you might be considering a plug-in hybrid like this Kia Sportage plug-in hybrid right next to me. Or you might be debating, can I really go all in on electricity like this Kia EV6 right next to me on the other side? The other reason you might want to check out a plug-in hybrid instead of a full EV at the moment is if you need a bigger cargo area and more headroom in the back, because that is certainly an asset when we take a look at any of the current compact crossover plug-in hybrids available in the US. This, something like the Mitsubishi Outlander, the Tucson, of course the RAV4 Prime, which is selling incredibly well in the US, they're shaped just like a regular compact crossover. And that's not quite what's going on here in the EV6. Now, going in for a closer look on the front end, you'll notice how much lower the EV6 is than the Sportage over here. Even though the Sportage is definitely designed for efficiency and it has a definite sloping hood line, the entire hood is much higher off the ground than in the EV6 because aerodynamics are a little less important when you can carry more energy on board. You'll notice that there's less cooling going on in the EV6, so really all that's happening is the cooling slot down there at the bottom. Up here, it's just an imitation grille. Full LED headlights in either model, but obviously the EV6 is much more style forward. The style is polarizing, I would say, on both of these vehicles, however, because this Sportage is probably the most polarizing vehicle that Kia sells that still runs on gasoline. Let me know what you think of the look, because I am not the biggest fan of this design up front. I think there's just a lot going on here. We have different sections of different styles of grille up here, some sort of egg crate thing going on there, more of a horizontal slat thing down here. We've got an homage to the tiger nose grille up top, and then lots of different shapes going on. The boomerang thing, full LED turn signals, full LED headlights in multi-modules, fog lights down below. Things are perhaps a tiny bit more traditional, I guess you could say, over here in the very non-traditional front end of the EV6. The hood is much shorter, full LED headlights and turn signals, but these are reflector LED headlights instead of projectors. Do kind of like the projectors a little bit more. You'll notice that this vehicle is wearing the carpool access stickers for California. In some states, you can drive an electric car or a plug-in hybrid in the carpool lane solo. So that's definitely a reason you might want to choose either of these over just a regular hybrid. EV6 versus Sportage plug-in hybrid is definitely a case of specifications not telling you the entire picture. On the outside, the EV6 is half an inch wider. It's also about an inch longer, but you'll notice that the Sportage definitely looks bigger and boxier from this angle. And that's because it definitely is boxier. We also get more ground clearance, 8.3 inches versus 6.1 inches. If you're concerned about the ability to mild off-road, rough road, or winter weather traverse, like snow drifts, things like that, obviously you shouldn't go in 12 inches of snow in either of these vehicles, but snow's going to accumulate a lot less underneath the Sportage because it is higher off the ground. And that's because it doesn't need to be as efficient. There's a lot more energy on board. And that's really obvious when you start taking a look at the profile of these vehicles. The greenhouse does not pinch in like we find in the EV6. It is considerably wider up top, and that continues all the way around to the cargo area in the back. It does have this sort of modern accentuated hip shape going on back here, but not nearly to the same extent that we find in the EV6. So it has a cargo area that's about 50% larger. In addition to being higher off the ground, the Sportage has a much higher roofline. It's really obvious from the back here. The roofline in the Sportage is a full 6 inches higher than the peak in the EV6, and it maintains that higher roofline all the way towards the rear. You can see this last 30 inches or so in the EV6 really slopes dramatically. And over here, even though we have a more raked profile than I might prefer in a crossover, it's a lot shorter than in the EV6. And that really has a big impact on the cargo capacity. If I open the trunk lid there, they both have power hatches. But you'll notice that over here in the EV6, we have sort of, I guess, a pyramid-shaped cargo area or a triangular-shaped cargo area. Really drastically slopes towards the rear. Back here towards the hatch area, really you'd only be able to put about a 12-inch tall item in there and have that hatch close. Over here in the Sportage, it is very, very different. It is still definitely angled, again, more than I might like at the top, but it is much bigger, much boxier, much squarer. We have just about 35 cubic feet of cargo space over here in the Sportage plug-in hybrid. You'll get nearly 40 if you get the regular hybrid model. And over here in the EV6, it's right around 24 cubic feet, just over. There's a big, big difference when it comes to, for instance, roller bags, where you could line up a bunch of 22-inch roller bags like this in the Sportage, and then over here in the EV6, you'd actually have to put them all the way back there in order for the lid to close. Now let's go ahead and whip out the measuring tape here so we can see some of the critical dimensions that folks have been asking about. The width of this opening, it's about 37 inches wide. That's the widest thing you could put in here. And it is about 38 inches long. Maximum height, which really is just the absolute maximum, that's about 26 inches. So let's go over here into the Sportage. See over here, maximum height's 29 inches. The width definitely is a little bit wider at 44 inches wide. Length, not too far apart, 39 inches there. So if you're the kind of person that wants to be able to go to Home Depot on a random Wednesday and grab a barbecue, keep in mind it's going to have to be a lot smaller of a barbecue in the EV6 than over here in the Sportage. Or logically, if you want to go on a road trip, you could put your family of four's luggage in the Sportage. Might be a bit of a squeeze. You're going to have to pack lighter in that EV. Of course, the EV6, like most EVs, has a storage area up front, but this is really quite small as far as modern EVs with frunks go, because Kia decided to make the front end overhang very, very short in the EV6. So there's just about enough room there for a California Duster, the vehicle to load connector, a Tesla tap, things like that. It's all housed inside a little pizza box style cover. Now, the big reason for that is that the hood is very short in the EV6. And if you take a look at a Mach-E or a Tesla Model Y, the hood's about 10 inches longer. And that's where the 10 to 12 inch cargo area really comes from in those vehicles. It's just that the hood is longer. The hood's also going to be a bit more upright. So this sleeker aerodynamic shape, which gives you excellent range on a smaller battery, is the reason that we don't find a big front trunk under here. If you want to go cold turkey and you want zero emissions, clearly there's only one option, and that's a full EV. But a plug-in hybrid like this can be a pragmatic alternative with certain limitations in mind. In EV mode, this drivetrain puts out just 90 horsepower, 224 pound-feet of torque. When everything is working together, you get 261 horsepower, 258 pound-feet of torque, and 0 to 60 that is pretty similar to the base version of the EV6. The base version of the EV6 has just 225 horsepower, but a ton of torque, and of course no transmission to worry about interrupting that torque flow either. This is the all-wheel drive version, 320 horsepower. You can get even more, of course, if you want the EV6 GT. That is, of course, going to be quite a bit more expensive. Obviously, there's going to be a difference in electric range as well. Over here in the Sportage, we get 34 miles of electric range. In this, you'll get up to 282 miles of electric range with all-wheel drive, 252 in the format that I'm looking at right here, and this is the GT line trim. Now, over here, you only get 34 miles of electric range, but afterwards you get 430 miles of gasoline range at about 34 miles per gallon. So this is an exercise in moving some or all of your gasoline consumption over to electricity, whereas this would be pulling the plug entirely. And there are some definite realities with this particular choice. If you're a numbers guy like I am, you might be lulled into a false sense of security thinking that the EV6 and the Sportage have interior dimensions that are identical. But hopping inside them, you will notice that they are very differently shaped. We have a full inch more headroom up front in here than we find in the EV6. If you're a taller driver or have a taller torso, this is going to be very important. Even at 6 feet tall, I find the EV6 to be a little bit tight. Not so the Sportage. I definitely have enough room in here. We have a tilt telescopic steering column, all the same sort of features that you might expect. What you might not be thinking of, though, is that the box is taller in the Sportage. So the seating position is more SUV-like. My legs are not quite as out in front of me. It's not quite as sedan-like of a driving position. Also, very different in the rear passenger area. Let's just go ahead and hop back here and see what's going on. Jumping into the rear seats, the first thing you'll notice on the spec sheet is that the EV6 has a little bit more legroom. In reality, it doesn't really feel like that. Also on the spec sheet, they have the same kind of headroom, and I think that's because they're probably measuring headroom in the most upright position for these seats, where you can see my head is almost touching the ceiling. But this is not a comfortable seating position. I'd probably prefer to be a little bit more reclined like that. And now I have about 3/4 of an inch of headroom. I could also go even further back and have a really comfortable position there. And this is when you're going to notice one other big difference. The side of the car is much further from my head over here than it is in the EV6. And that's because this dimension, the side of this pillar all the way to the side of that pillar, is almost 5 inches wider in the Sportage than in the EV6. This is kind of an illusion, I guess you'd say. Moving into the EV6, you'll immediately notice the difference. The front seat in both of these vehicles is adjusted for me, about the same kind of legroom really. My knees are much higher off the ground because the floor is not as low as in the Sportage, so a lot less thigh support is going on. theoretically the same amount of headroom, but if I put my head back to the headrest, my head is actually touching the ceiling. And that's just because of the way headroom numbers are measured. They're measured with the dummy, not with their head back there on the headrest like you might want to be resting. They're sitting a little bit further forward. And in this position, my hair is brushing the ceiling. Now, this also has a rear seat recline, but it becomes less comfortable because I actually get less headroom the way that this ceiling is shaped, that drastically dropping roofline. And regardless of the position that I'm in, my head is only about an inch from the pillar on the side, and that's again because of this tight dimension there. What's weird about this, in a way, is that the hip measurements on the spec sheet are identical practically between the two vehicles. That's side of the door to the side of the door. Also, shoulder room, pretty similar because of where it's measured on the doors. But this entire pillar area up here, that's a critical dimension that is not captured on the spec sheet. As you might expect with both of these cars manufactured by the same company, there are a lot of interior themes that are common. The way the steering wheel buttons are laid out, the fact that we have this enormous dual 12-inch LCD instrument cluster and infotainment screen on the dashboard, that is shared between the two models. Now, in the Sportage plug-in hybrid, this is optional. The base version is going to have the 12-inch infotainment screen here, but it's not going to have the 12-inch instrument cluster. That's only going to be found in the top trim Sportage plug-in hybrid. They both have the same infotainment controls. They both have a rotary style shifter, but this console does become a little bit different in theme. Over here we have cup holders that can be configured differently. So if I take that out there, you can rotate those little I don't know, whatever those things are in there, and then you can put larger items in this entire console area, and then you can push this button and have those pop out. That's kind of a handy touch. We also have more controls over the all-wheel drive system. This does have a mechanical all-wheel drive. It's not a second electric motor like we find in a RAV4 Prime. Reasonable amount of storage space right there under that center console, and a reasonable amount of width generally when we're talking about the front seat area. Even though, again, on the spec sheets, it appears very similar in terms of interior dimensions, this is a little bit wider across the front. Also, another thing to keep in mind is we do have a panoramic moonroof inside here, and we have a pretty typical sized moonroof in the EV6. Jumping into the EV6, the design is definitely a variation on the theme. We have a 2-spoke steering wheel instead of the 3-spoke, but the controls, they're all basically the same, as are the stocks. As is the instrument cluster and the LCD infotainment system. Same LCDs, slightly different software style. You can see that things are trying to be a little bit more modern over there on that side. Over here, the software is pretty similar, slightly different icons, but the same interface for Apple CarPlay. The dashboard is definitely more of a modern theme. No imitation wood going on in here. Instead, we get some ambient lighting strips. And then, of course, we get the hallmark that we see in other dedicated EV platforms, a flat floor and a lot of storage space up front. Now, my one complaint is that Kia puts the USB input and the USB charging port so far away from the driver and front passenger that it is kind of difficult to use. And also you have that cable stretching around because neither of these vehicles supports wireless CarPlay integration. So you're just ending up stuffing your phone wherever it can go. Here in the center console, we have touch buttons for the climate controls. The touchscreen setup for the infotainment buttons, same one that we find in the Sportage. Actually, it's exactly the same display. And this is not my favorite in the industry right now because this does both infotainment and climate controls, and you have to switch between the two with that little touch button. Invariably, it's going to be on the wrong mode for what you want to do at the moment. Down here, we have the same rotary shifter. We don't have drive modes here. They're actually on the steering wheel over here, but there's no sort of off-road or locky mode to try and send more power to the opposite axle. You're just going to have to let the software do its thing. In here we have a Qi wireless charging mat right there, and then we have a definitely decently sized storage area between the front seats. It's definitely larger than what we find in the Sportage because there's no need for a transmission tunnel or anything like that. So if we move back to the back seats, flat floor back here, flat floor up front. Out on the road, the two vehicles are going to feel very different. Obviously, the EV6 is a ton of fun, especially in the all-wheel drive format. This is very, very quick, just as people have come to expect from modern EVs. This model, 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, because this is the all-wheel drive version. Now, if you get the rear-wheel drive only model, it is going to be notably slower, 7.2. So the rear-wheel drive EV6 is actually a little bit slower than the plug-in hybrid Sportage at 6.9 seconds. But this is about 2 seconds faster, 0 to 60. And the feel of the transmission and the engine is very, very different because this has a single speed transmission. It's just a reduction gear, so there's no shifting, nothing like that. You just floor it and you go. The power delivery is very immediate. In contrast, the Sportage's plug-in hybrid system feels more like Frankenstein's monster because it does have an electric motor in there, but it's not going to deliver power in a linear fashion. it's running through the 6-speed automatic transmission. Of course, power from the engine is also going to be running through that traditional 6-speed auto. Now, that's not to say that it's a horrible plug-in hybrid or anything like that. It actually is quite good as far as plug-in hybrids go, but compared to the smoothness and immediate power delivery you find in any EV, it's going to feel very, very different and perhaps a little old school. Some people might like that, some people might not. When switching between power sources, it's also going to take longer. If you need 90 horsepower, that power delivery is pretty linear, with the exception of the 6-speed automatic transmission. But if you want all 261 horsepower, you have to wait for the engine to start, rev up, and then deliver all that power. So if you floor it, you kind of get a moment of acceleration, and then it's wait for it, bam, everything else starts to happen. When it comes to the braking distance scores, the Sportage does very well, just 126 feet from 60 miles an hour to 0. That's versus 129 feet for the rear-wheel drive base EV6, 132 feet for the all-wheel drive base version of the EV6. If you get this GT line, then it does drop down to a little bit below the plug-in hybrid Sportage, but the reason for that is that this is heavier. This is about 300 pounds heavier than the plug-in hybrid. That's something that a lot of folks don't quite get when they're thinking about these things. Yes, it has two different drivetrains on board. Yes, it has a battery, and it has a motor, and it has an engine, etc. But all of that complexity is much lighter than a battery pack like the one that we find in the EV6. Even though this battery pack is 30% smaller than the battery that we find in the Ford Mustang Mach-E's big battery model. So everything is going to scale depending on the EV you're looking at. Some are lighter than this, and some are considerably heavier than this. Yes, this is heavier. This is actually an additional 200 pounds heavier than the all-wheel drive wind trim, but because this one has slightly wider tires on it and a considerably lower center of gravity, this is an awful lot more fun to drive than the Sportage. If you floor it around corners like this, the rear power bias definitely makes it feel more engaging to drive, really powers you around the corner in a way the Sportage is just not capable of. And the Sportage's slightly softer tuning and the weight balance in the vehicle really means that there's more tip and dive, more body roll. That rear end really starts to feel heavy if you start to push it harder out on your favorite winding mountain road. It is absolutely solid for a compact crossover, but it's not the same level of engagement or fun that you'd find in this or a Mach-E or a Tesla Model Y, of course. When it comes to the cabin noise score, they're actually pretty similar if they're in EV mode. This particular model of EV6 has wider tires than we find on the Sportage, so I'd call that a tie. Out on a rougher gravel road like the one that we're on here, the EV6 has excellent ride quality for an EV. It's not firm and bouncy like we find in the Model Y or the Mach-E, but it still is not as compliant as a lot of plug-in hybrids, something like the Sportage plug-in hybrid actually, or the Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid, or the Toyota plug-in hybrid that's in competition in the same segment as well. And I think that simply has to do with the amount of suspension travel that we have available to those vehicles. They're higher off the ground, there's just more clearance there for the shock towers, the suspension components, etc. Vehicles like this that are relatively low slung, and efficiency is very important in, they tend to not have as much suspension motion. You can't damp the potholes and things like that, the speed bumps that you're going to encounter quite as much. But again, this still performs well for an EV, but the ride quality win has to go to the Kia. The other thing you'll notice out on a surface like this is all-wheel drive traction ability. In an electric vehicle like this, it can obviously send more power to the front, more power to the rear whenever it likes to, but it doesn't know that wheel slip is going to happen until it has actually happened. And in a vehicle with a mechanical four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive system, like the Sportage or say a Wrangler or Grand Cherokee 4xe, you can preemptively try and send power to the other axle. If you know you're going to be in a slippery situation, you hit the lock button, and even if it's not a complete lockup of the clutch pack, the Sportage is close but not complete, it will still balance power more or less 50-50 front and rear before the slip even happens. And you will notice that on slippery surfaces in this. The rear wheels start to slip because it's rear power biased, then it sends power to the front. Whereas in the Sportage, it doesn't really have that same kind of slip profile. It's more of a left to right kind of slipping, and in that instance, it's basically the same as this EV6 because both systems are going to use brakes to control left to right power distribution. If you're interested in buying either one of these, technically they're sold in all 50 states. Every Kia dealer should be able to at least order a Sportage plug-in hybrid or an EV6. If you don't find one on the lot, check other Kia dealers nearby. Again, they should all be certified to sell EVs in all 50 states. Now, actual availability, that is tricky on both of these, and dealer markups are crazy. But let's talk about MSRP anyway. Sportage here, plug-in hybrid starts at $38,690. The top trim, which is what I'm driving here, $43,191. That's going to get you adaptive cruise control, the 12-inch instrument cluster, the upgraded audio system, etc. Keep in mind that there are going to be a few features on the base EV6 that you won't find on a base Sportage. But any way you slice it, the EV6 is going to be a lot more expensive. It's going to start at $48,700. It's going to buy you a 225 horsepower rear-wheel drive model, not all-wheel drive like we find standard on the Sportage plug-in hybrid, and 0 to 60 is largely going to be the same. It's about 7 seconds for both of these options. If you want the 320 horsepower all-wheel drive system, it's a lot more expensive, $52,600, and this GT line trim that we're looking at right now came in at around $57,600. The only option on this model was the different upholstery on the inside that costs a little bit extra. Both of them have the same destination charge, which is just under $1,400. So any way you slice it, the EV6 is going to be a lot more expensive. But is it going to be more expensive to keep around? Cost of operation is a tricky thing to talk about because not everybody pays the same cost for energy around the US. In fact, energy costs vary wildly, whether we're talking about gasoline or electricity. So let me be super duper clear because everybody gets confused about it. When I'm talking about electricity prices, I'm talking about 100% renewable energy from PG&E in the area that we are talking about, which is the area that I live in Northern California. In this geographic area, if you want 100% renewable sourced energy, it's about 30 to 31 cents a kilowatt hour currently. So whatever you're paying wherever you are, you do you. Obviously, the math is going to change. But here, 31 cents a kilowatt hour, and my calculations for gasoline are based off of $5 a gallon, because if gasoline isn't $5 a gallon right now, it might be again. Who knows? Anyway, there are some additional things to think about. On the plug-in hybrid systems like this, you're still going to have to do oil changes. You're still going to have to do additional filter and fluid changes for various systems in the vehicle. It uses a traditional automatic, so obviously that's going to have to get changed as well. And it has a traditional mechanical all-wheel drive system that may require some kind of long-term maintenance. Long-term maintenance is likely going to be lower on the EV6, but it still exists. There are still fluid changes required in the reduction gears, front and rear. Those maintenance schedules are pretty long, of course. We still have a cabin air filter, we still have tires and brakes that have to be dealt with as well. We also have higher insurance costs, generally speaking, on some EVs. Some of that is simply a factor of the MSRP, which is higher, so obviously it's going to be more expensive to insure a more expensive vehicle, and some of it has to do with battery electric vehicles still being new tech and their general concerns about repairability. That's definitely something we've seen with modern Teslas. A lot of modern Teslas, they're the single largest seller of EVs in the US. They have definitely had a bit of a problem with insurance companies choosing to simply write off a vehicle rather than try and repair it, because either they don't know how to repair it or they don't want to repair it, whatever the reason. It's going to be a little bit less likely to happen in a plug-in hybrid system like this because more of it is normative. However, it still could happen if something happens with the battery pack in the rear. Now, that battery pack is, of course, less expensive. Now, speaking of battery life, that's another reason you might want to choose a plug-in hybrid over an EV. Obviously, this battery is going to start to degrade over time. Exactly how much it will degrade, we don't know, because this is a relatively new EV. But if we take a look at modern Teslas, you should expect maybe about a 20% reduction in battery capacity over the average ownership cycle of the EV. Now, that next owner will obviously be starting at a reduced battery capacity rate, and then it might go down from there. But 80% is a decent number from what we've seen from the data as far as an expectation goes. You might be higher, you might be lower based on your average usage. Over here in a plug-in hybrid, it is much less likely to happen because the battery pack is not used the same way as it is in an EV. That may sound weird because this has an electric mode, so it's driving in electric-only operation. Sure, but it's not going to ever charge as fast, and it's not going to discharge as fast as the battery in a full EV. And when you only have the battery to draw on, the battery might be charged to 100% sometimes because you want all that range. And that is another thing to keep in mind. If you want the maximum range, that's going to be 282 miles in the all-wheel drive base version of the EV6, but not if you charge it only to 80% or 90% as the manufacturer is recommending. Over here in a plug-in hybrid, it's never charging the battery completely. There's always a decent portion of the battery reserved for battery life, so you plug it in, it charges all the way up. There's actually no way even to change the way this is charging the battery in software. Because it's never charging completely, it's never discharging completely, battery lifetime seems to be much more consistent in plug-in hybrids. We've seen that in some of Toyota's plug-in hybrids for a while, etc. It's likely going to be the same case in this. And even if the battery loses 10%, 20%, even 30% of its range over your ownership cycle in a plug-in hybrid, you still have the gas tank. So you're still able to go basically the same kind of road trip range that you were when the car was new. Of course, obviously your carbon emissions will be changing over time as well. Now let me know what you think about all that as well, and let me know what would you pick, what are you interested in as far as your next vehicle goes. I have to admit I am really torn. I love the way a full EV like this drives. It definitely is more fun out on the road, even though some situations it may not brake as quickly or it may not handle as well, may not be as off-road capable. It is just more fun than a plug-in hybrid system like this. This feels kind of like a traditional vehicle with some funky things going on now and then. Again, the drivetrain is not going to be as smooth as a full EV or as some regular hybrids as well, but it is more of that pragmatic choice. It is bigger, it is roomier on the inside, it gives you that road trip range that you might be interested in. For me, living off-grid out here in the forest, it means that I would not have to worry about how much sun I'm getting. I could always make it to work without a problem. Let me know about that down there in the comment section below. Of course, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Check out our EV Buyer's Guide channel if you haven't already done that. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those other places. I'll see all of you next week.